Hi, Steve here with digitalphotographygear.com, and today I'm going to talk a little about Canon portrait lenses. I'm going to go over what makes a good portrait lens, what you should look for in a portrait lens, and offer a couple suggestions as well. So let's start off by defining a portrait. A portrait is simply a picture of a person. So you can take a portrait with any lens, any camera, and as long as it's a picture of a person, then it's a portrait. But for good classic portraiture, you want not only flattering lighting and flattering posing, but also a nice flattering perspective as well. And that's the first thing that we're going to talk about is perspective. Generally, for a good classic portrait, you're going to want something in the 70mm to 135mm range. That creates the most natural looking perspective. Using a wide lens will distort your subject, make their nose look larger, make their ears look smaller, and on the other side of the spectrum, using a long lens, it's going to cause you to be further away. It's really going to compress your image and make your subject look almost two-dimensional and flatter than a lens in the 70 to 135 range. Not only is the 70 to 135 range good for its natural looking perspective, but it's also a good working distance for a portrait lens. Using a wide angle lens, it'll force you to be closer to your subject, and not everybody likes to be in that close a vicinity to their photographer, so it could cause unnatural looking facial expressions and awkward posing. And again, using a super telephoto, you're going to be so far away from your subject that giving posing instructions, you're going to have to yell or shout to them, and also you simply might not have the room for it if you're shooting indoors with a long lens, or if you're outdoors and there's a fence or a wall that you have to back up against. So yeah, 70 to 135 is a nice good focal length range, and there are also a couple other things you should look for in a portrait lens. One being image quality, of course, which is something that you should look for in a lens regardless of what you're going to be using it for. And another is its maximum aperture. You're most likely going to want a lens with a nice wide maximum aperture, commonly referred to as a fast lens, because using a wider aperture allows you to use faster shutter speeds, hence the term fast glass, or using a fast lens or a slow lens, things like that. But what it does for portraits is when you're shooting at a wide aperture is especially outdoors and you have distracting background elements, you open up your lens and you can throw the background more out of focus to really isolate your subject and draw the attention of your photo to your subject. Using a lens indoors in a studio setting where you have a backdrop, the speed of a lens doesn't become quite as necessary, but it's a nice thing to have, not only for throwing your background out of focus, but also it opens the door for when and where you can shoot, just because a wide aperture has more light gathering capability as well. So speaking of an out of focus background, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is called bokeh. Bokeh refers to the out-of-focus elements of a photograph and the qualities of that out-of-focus region. A good, smooth, pleasing to the eye bokeh is caused by a round iris opening, which is made by rounded aperture blades and more aperture blades, whereas bokeh that is of lesser quality will appear to be choppy and textured. And that's caused by an iris opening that is made by fewer aperture blades and also aperture blades that are just straight and not rounded. So if you take two pictures side by side, let's say with one lens with a round iris and another lens with an iris that's pentagon shaped, for instance, you can tell one's going to be choppy and the other's going to be more smooth. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You don't want the background to have choppy, out-of-focus regions, because it could potentially distract your viewer from your model, which is where you want the attention to be. So one more thing that you should keep in mind when choosing a portrait lens is what camera you're using. You can either have a full frame, an APS-H, or an APS-C sensor size. A full frame, 100 millimeters will look like 100 millimeters, whereas if you're using, let's say, a 7D or a 60D, for instance, which has an APS-C sensor size, it has a 1.6 times crop factor, so your field of view will be cropped. So your field of view, if using that same 100 millimeter lens, will appear to be that of if you were to use a 160 millimeter lens on a full frame. This only changes your field of view. It doesn't change your lens's focal length or the perspective or your depth of field. It merely changes your field of view. So it basically just takes a smaller crop from your image circle that the lens creates. Instead of a full frame uses the entire image circle, an APS-C sensor or an APS-H will take a smaller crop of that same image circle. So keep that in mind. If you have limited space, and let's say you get a 100 millimeter lens for your 7D, and you're expecting it to be to look like a 100 millimeter lens on a 5D, for instance, and then you put it on your camera and it looks like a 160 millimeter field of view, you just might not have the space for it. So keep that in mind. A couple recommendations that I like for portraiture. I'm going to start off with this one. This is probably my favorite portrait lens. This is the 85mm f1.2L lens. The reason I like this lens is because in 85mm it's a nice and natural looking perspective. It's a very fast lens at f1.2. You can really throw your background out of focus with an aperture that wide. And it's also very, very good image quality. Even when you shoot it at wide apertures like f1.2 or f1.4, it's very sharp, great color, great contrast, great quality of the out of focus regions, the bokeh. So the only thing is it's fat, it's heavy, and it's expensive. So those are some of the drawbacks of that lens. Another great portrait lens, which is a little more versatile, is the 70-200 f2.8L lens. This one has the image stabilizer, it's the version 2, but this is a great lens because it's just so versatile, but going from 70mm to 200mm, great working focal length. Its maximum aperture is f2.8 throughout its entire range, so you can really get good image compression, good subject isolation with this lens. And the image stabilizer also helps for shooting without a tripod, assuming your subject is standing still. Other good portrait lenses for Canon are the 135 f2L, which is nice. It's a little longer than the 85, for instance, and it's a little bit slower at f2 compared to f1.2. So, but again, you can, since it's a longer focal length, it'll compress your image more and really separate your subject from the background. Some other good portrait lenses that I recommend are the 100mm macro. It's a little slower at f2.8, but it's great image quality, nice and sharp, and it also has image stabilizer, so again, using it without a tripod is no problem. And it's also great because it has the bonus of being a macro lens. For more environmental portraits, you can use something wider like a 50mm lens, which Canon makes 3 of. Any of them are great, just depending on what your budget is. Canon also makes a 35mm L lens, which is great for wider, more environmental portraits. And there are a couple lenses that are specially designed for APS-C sensor size SLRs. They're EFS lenses, which are nice. The 60mm macro lens is one, and the 17-55 f2.8 is another one. But yeah, using the right lens for the right portrait job is really important too. So if you want a nice tight head and shoulders portrait, you're not going to want to use something that would be more designed for environmental portraits, and vice versa. But definitely choose a lens that's good quality, and if you're doing classic portraiture, stay in that 70 to 135 millimeter range, and you'll have a nice working distance and nice perspective as well. So those are a few of my recommendations. I hope this has helped you choose a portrait lens, and join me next time when I talk about some more photography related topics and review some more gear on digitalphotographygear.com.